Hello learners. Today we'll be discussing about impact of climate change on biodiversity. The remarkable loss of biodiversity with an estimated extinction of species every 20 minutes indicates that a sixth mass extinction is proceeding. There is now evidence that climate change is one of the prime factors responsible for this exceptional biodiversity loss, with further accelerated extinction expected during the coming decades. Climate is a primary driver of many biological processes, transacting from individuals to ecosystems, and affects, in fact, all the facets of human life. Therefore, changing climate could cause large and likely serious impacts on ecological and social systems. Climate change is not only changing the biosphere and biodiversity in the marine and terrestrial environments, it is also modifying ecosystem processes and changes the resilience capacity of the ecosystems to any kind of changes, particularly the environmental change. There is an urgent need to reduce the socio-ecological consequences of changing biodiversity due to climate change. You know, climate change and biodiversity are interconnected. Biodiversity is affected by climate change with negative consequences or repercussions for human well-being, but biodiversity through the ecosystem services also makes an important contribution to both climate change mitigation and adaptation. Climate change affects the biological diversity, including the speciation, redistribution, local adaptations and extinction events in a significant way. Therefore, a concerted effort, a pragmatic effort is required to deal with biodiversity and climate change to make sure that the impacts of climate change on biodiversity are reduced. Further, the biodiversity and ecosystems together can contribute enough solutions related to climate change, adaptation and mitigation. The climate change adaptation and mitigation measures do not negatively impact biodiversity through changes in land management practices. Today, we will be discussing about the concept of biodiversity and the interaction between biodiversity and climate change and what are the possible or potential impacts of climate change on biodiversity. Let us see the biodiversity concept. You know, the Convention on Biological Diversity has defined biodiversity as the variability among the living organisms from all sources, including the terrestrial, marine environments and other aquatic ecosystems, and the ecological complexes of which they are part of it. Okay, this is the basic definition given by the Convention of Biological Diversity. The biodiversity or biological diversity, basically it refers to the number of species of plants, animals and microorganisms and the ecosystems. It also refers to the variety of the ecosystems on the planet, such as the tropical rainforests, the deserts, the mangroves, the grasslands, the coral reefs and so on and so forth. So the biological diversity, it is exactly the variability. This is the basis for living organisms. Its ecosystems provide the vital services, ecosystem services. This variety can be observed at various levels, particularly the genetic diversity, the species diversity and ecosystem diversity. When I talk about genetic diversity, I am talking about the genetic variability within a species. On the other hand, the variety of species within a community is called as species diversity. The organization of species in an area into distinctive plant and animal communities, we call it as ecosystem diversity. The biodiversity provides people with the basic ecosystem goods and services. It provides goods such as food, fiber and medicine and services such as water purification, climate regulation, erosion control and even the biogeochemical nutrient cycling also. The biodiversity also plays an important role in economic sectors that drive development, including the agriculture, the fisheries, forestry and tourism. People rely on the marine and coastal biodiversity and forest resources, non-timber forest products also, like the fruits, the leaves, for their livelihood. Biodiversity is necessary for our existence. In fact, it is very essential for all living organisms, for that matter. When we talk about the biodiversity values, it includes economic values, social values, and intrinsic values. Economic values, what I mean to say is that the biodiversity, the goods and products are sold for income or used as inputs to other economic activities. You can call it, for example, the ecotourism. As far as the social values are concerned, it provides employment opportunities, health benefits, and it improves the quality of life, social security, livelihood, and whatnot. Every possible way, the biological resources are helping the mankind, human beings. When you talk about the intrinsic values, in many cultures and human societies, some components of biodiversity have intrinsic value in their own right, irrespective of any material contribution to human well-being. And now let us discuss why the biodiversity is important, or in other words, in fact, the biodiversity loss is definitely a cause of concern. So let us see why it is so, the way it is. The extinction of biodiversity loss is a natural process. The geological record indicates that hundreds of plant and animal species have disappeared over the time as they failed to adapt to the changing climatic conditions due to geological events like continental drift, massive volcanic eruptions, or asteroid impacts. In the present era, or we call that as an Anthropocene era, human beings are the most powerful agents of environmental change, driving the latest wave of extinction. Human activities have already caused the destruction of over one-third of the world's forest. The rapidly escalating human demand for the natural resources is causing, the species, genes, and habitat to disappear at an unprecedented rate. The total number of species on Earth, as per the current estimates, vary between 5 to 100 million. The current rates and magnitude of species extinction far exceed the normal background rates. In fact, the conservative estimates indicate that the human activity has increased the extinction rates of plants and vertebrates to between 10 and 100 times the normal background rate. How and why the biodiversity is important? Since the earliest date of recorded history, the fundamental social, ethical, cultural, and economic values of human beings have directly or indirectly revolved around the biological resources. The diversity in the genes, species, and ecosystems has contributed immensely to the productivity of the agriculture, forestry, fisheries, organisms, living organisms, and even the industry. And loss of all these is a matter of a great concern indeed. The trends of habitat loss, overexploitation, invasive alien species, pollution, environmental pollution, and climate change, coupled with the ever-growing demand for the biological resources, continue to threaten the functioning of life-sustaining biosphere. The current global warming is already affecting species and ecosystems around the world. Particularly, the most vulnerable ecosystems are, the coral reefs, the mountain ecosystems, and polar ecosystems. The rate and magnitude of climate change induced by increased, radiatively active gases has, started to show symptoms. It started to affect the biodiversity, either directly or in combination with other drivers of change. As I said, the pollution, environmental pollution, invasive species, habitat changes, habitat losses also, fragmentation, so on and so forth. It is estimated that by the year 2050, the global population will increase to around 9.2 billion people. As the very functioning of life in the planet depends upon the biological resources, and the ecosystem services and the livelihood security offered by it, the loss and imbalance of the web of life, I'm talking about the biological resources, will hurt us in innumerable number of ways. So conserving and sustainably managing the natural terrestrial ecosystems, freshwater ecosystems, marine ecosystems, and restoring the degraded ecosystems with their genetic and species diversity is necessary for the overall goals of both the Convention on Biological Diversity and also the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Now let us discuss about the interaction between biodiversity and climate change. The issues of climate change and biodiversity are interconnected. Considering the climate change effects on the biodiversity and through changes in the biodiversity that affect climate change. According to the report of the second ad hoc technical expert group on biodiversity, Convention on Biological Diversity, it was estimated that about 2,500 gigatons of carbon is stored in the terrestrial ecosystem. An additional 38,000 gigaton of carbon is stored in the oceans, the major reservoir. In fact, it's in the carbon is stored in the form of carbonates and bicarbonates. And when you see it in the atmosphere, it is only 750 gigatons of carbon. On an average, 160 gigatons of carbon cycle naturally between the biosphere, all the terrestrial, marine and all the ecosystems, even the ocean ecosystems and the atmosphere. It kind of 160 gigatons of carbon cycle, that's a very important thing. So carbon cycle is essentially very important for the existence of life on Earth. We can infer from this particular information on the carbon cycle that even the small changes in the ocean and terrestrial sources, carbon sources and sinks can have a large implications for atmospheric carbon dioxide levels. The anthropogenic or human-induced climate change, caused by the accumulation of radiatively active gases in the atmosphere, could shift the net natural carbon cycle towards annual net emissions from the terrestrial sinks and weaken the ocean sinks, thus accelerating climate change. Hence, small changes in the ocean carbon sources or terrestrial carbon sources and even the sinks of the carbon dioxide can have a large implications for atmospheric carbon dioxide levels. Ecosystems provide a wide range of provisioning services, regulating services, cultural services, and supporting services. These services, ecosystem services, are fundamental to human well-being, like human health, livelihoods, nutritional food security, social security, and cohesion. While ecosystems are generally more carbon dense and biologically more diverse in their natural state, the degradation of many ecosystems is significantly reducing their carbon storage and sequestration capacity, resulting in increased emission of greenhouse gases and loss of biodiversity at various levels like genetic, species and ecosystem level. Due to climate change, the stress on ecosystems is increasing continuously and it is also intensifying the effects of other stresses like habitat fragmentation, habitat loss and degradation, overexploitation, invasive alien species, population pressure and pollution. Climate change is constantly altering the biosphere both in the marine and terrestrial environments on large and small scales through biodiversity loss. The most important biotic alteration due to climate change come to know as I'll repeat. The most important biotic alterations due to climate change is due to the changed species interactions. For example, coral bleaching, an alteration of the relationship between the corals and their symbiotic algae due to high water temperature has occurred in all tropical reef ecosystems. The second example is the massive tree mortality associated with the bark beetle outbreaks, This is basically triggered by a temperature-driven change in the emergence that does result in the emergence of the bark beetles. As a result of this particular incident, the entire ecosystems are rearranged either by the species range shifts or by the consequences of the changing interactions or the phenology. That is thing happened because of climate change. Next trend is, when you look at the changes that like poleward and up slope range shifts of the species, and many of organism ecosystems collapse or disappear. Some new ecosystems also will be formed in the process of the change shift. The second important trend that we have noticed because of the climate change impact on biodiversity is the extinctions. That may be because of expansion of the invasive species, or there are many reasons, also many other drivers for that. The third important trend is the you can find the major losses in the freshwater and marine habitats. And next is the you'll be having the phenology. I just talked about the phenology, the events, the phenology or the timing of biological events that has been altered because of climate change. And one important thing is that in agriculture system, if you see, there are a lot of changes in the pest and disease causing organisms, and this is again a cause of concern. Besides this, the climate change will also have a negative impact on the ability of the biodiversity to deliver the ecosystem services. Further, the climate change will have negative impact on the local economics and livelihood, because due to the poor or the other vulnerable groups like women, or the local groups, local indigenous groups, they all depend on the biodiversity and ecosystem services. So that's the reason why the negative impacts of climate change can have a drastic effect on the vulnerable people, particularly the local and indigenous people living in the forest ecosystems, or in what you call the ecosystem which is drastically will be affected because of climate change. So biodiversity and healthy ecosystems are important resource for increasing the resilience and reducing the risks and damages associated with the negative impacts of climate change. They can also serve as natural buffers against any kind of eventualities like extreme climate events or weather events, like such as the changing patterns of rainfalls because of the climate change, the droughts, the storms, other disasters. So this is a very important benefit of biodiversity, and it can definitely act as a buffer. The diversified and integrated production systems offer more options for adapting to a changing climatic condition. This is very much true with agriculture ecosystems, because the more the system is diversified and it is integrated, definitely it will be an insurance against the climate change systems. When I mean climate change systems, the climate change and also the climate variability aspect. The ecosystem based production systems, they are very unique because they reduce the reliance on the synthetic inputs and associated emission of greenhouse gases. So ecosystem based production system should be preferred. And in addition, we can even breed crops or plant types against the drought condition, even the salt condition, the disease resistant plants also we can breed. Livestock breeds, fish also, that can definitely provide a lot of benefits, because it will be having an adaptation benefit as far as the climate change is concerned. It can also provide the livelihood benefits to the people who are dependent on these biological resources. The efforts to protect and restore the habitats, not only benefit the biodiversity, but also, benefit the local population also, and also it can provide, the cost-effective measures to mitigate climate change. In fact, if you look at the ecosystems such as forest, croplands, rangelands, peatlands, they are basically, valuable resources as far as the carbon storage capacity is concerned. So their conservation, restoration, And sustainable use is definitely very much a part of every government's intended nationally determined contributions, and is therefore a critical element for the fulfillment of the Paris Agreement on climate change. It's a recent agreement, signed Paris Agreement on climate change. It's a significant and a watershed agreement which puts a lot of accountability or responsibility on the part of the government across the world to take measures to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions, and definitely that can have a positive impact on all the possible ecosystems and definitely the biological resources. So the point here is we have understood the impacts of climate change on biodiversity. On the other hand, if you look at it, the biodiversity is having a lot of role, benefit to play as far as the mitigation, climate change mitigation and adaptation is concerned. The biodiversity has a potentially significant role to play in both climate change mitigation and adaptation. Let us see one by one what are the major key points, bottom line. The first is the biodiversity can support efforts to reduce the negative effects of climate change. So conserving or restoring the habitats can remove the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, thus helping to address the climate change by storing carbon, like it's definitely like a carbon storehouse. For example, reducing the emissions from deforestation activity or forest degradation activity that can have a positive impact as far as the climate change mitigation is concerned. The second important aspect or the role the biodiversity is playing with respect to the climate change management is conserving the intact ecosystems, like your mangroves, that can help to reduce the disastrous impact of climate change, such as flooding and storm surges. The third important role is the biodiversity can enhance the resilience of ecosystem structure to environmental changes, such as the prolonged drought conditions. So to sum up, today we have discussed the concept of biodiversity and what exactly the interactions or the interrelationship between biodiversity and climate change. Thereafter, we have discussed the potential impacts of climate change on biodiversity. Finally, I've just pointed out a few points regarding the role the biodiversity can play in climate change management, that is, in climate change adaptation and mitigation. Thank you.